taught by Hassan, who has been with us from the beginning of the whole thing. Our father, the Professor Dr. Daikh, the Hasnaawi. Our seminar today is about proteins. We know that proteins are the most abundant organic molecules in the living system. They are in every part in the cells, and they constitute about 50% of the dry weight of the cells. In our presentation, we'll focus on the definition of proteins and function of proteins, structure of proteins, and some clinical problems related to the proteins. And we will deep in some important proteins in the body like hemoglobin and myoglobin, and we will talk about structure of hemoglobin and myoglobin, and T hemoglobin and R hemoglobin, and allosteric effectors and dissociation curve. Okay, proteins. What are proteins? To define proteins, we will focus from where did they come. We will find that they are polymers of amino acids which link together by peptide bonds. The function of proteins, they do most of work in cells, like when we want, like receptors, enzymes, and many things like hormones and regulation of the body. And they are required for the structure, function, and regulation of the body's tissues and cells. Structure of proteins, we know that from the definition of proteins that they are polymers of amino acids. Different proteins in the whole body are only from 20 amino acids. These amino acids are linked together in a special sequence detected or determined by the genetic code. This sequence of amino acids determine the whole structure and the three-dimensional structure of the whole protein. The three-dimensional structure gives the proteins the binding size of other molecules, thereby detecting its function. Any protein inside the body must be folded in a way that is stable, flexible, and able to be function in the correct site in the cell, and capable to be regulated by enzymes. Structure of proteins is simply termed by 4 types. These types are primary structure, as we said in the definition of proteins, which consist of amino acids that are linked together. And secondary structure, when the primary structure is folded, it will form a three-dimensional structure, which is the secondary structure. And when we fold the secondary structure, it will form to us the tertiary structure. And finally, we have the quaternary structure. We'll start from the primary structure in some detail. We see here the definition of primary structure is the linear sequence of amino acids forming the backbone of a protein. When we look to this picture, we see a polypeptide chain that is formed by 50 amino acids. These amino acids are linked together by peptide bonds, and the primary structure denotes the linear sequence and number of amino acids that are linked together and determined by the genetic code. And the higher level of any protein inside the body is determined by this primary structure. And the primary structure is specially and stabilized by a very strong covalent, which is the peptide bond. As we see here in this picture, this is a chain, a polypeptide chain, which is formed by amino acids. And we see the first amino acid has a free amino group and called amino end or N-terminal, and the last one has a free carboxyl group, which is called the carboxyl end or the C-terminus. Okay. We said that amino acids are linked by peptide bond. So what is the peptide bond? When a carboxyl group of one amino acid is linked with another amino group from the second amino acid, they will form to us a peptide bond. This peptide bond links successive amino acids and to form a polypeptide chain. Since most of carboxylic groups and amino groups are linked together to form this peptide bond, they will not form any other bonding except hydrogen bonds to form another structure, which is the secondary structure or tertiary structure. And the peptide bond occurs in trans configuration because it has a partial double bond character. This partial double bond character gives it trans configuration and doesn't allow the polypeptide chain to rotate during the folding of secondary and tertiary structure. Okay, how this peptide bond is formed? When we look to this picture, we'll find this is the first amino acid. Will give a hydroxyl group from its carboxylic group, which linked with the hydrogen group from the second amino acids from the amine group to form water, which is elevated and form for us this amine, this peptide bond, and it's strong and partial double bond to form us at a trans configuration. This is all about the primary structure. Okay, we say the primary structure is just a number and sequence of amino acids. As we add amino acids, this sequence or these polypeptide chains will turn to be bent or coiled in a special arrangement to form to us a secondary structure. So the secondary structure is the spatial folding of the polypeptide chain to form a 3D arrangement of the atoms in the molecule. As we see here, this was the primary structure and it's elongated. It will form us or twist and form to us a curved alpha helix chain, or just bend in the and form to us a beta plated sheath. So simply, types of secondary structure are of 3 types. We have the alpha helix, which is curved and twisted, and we have the beta sheet, which is plated, and we have the beta turns that change the direction of these sheets and helixes. The properties of the alpha helix structure. When we look at this picture, we'll find that this is a polypeptide chain, but the structure of this polypeptide chain is characterized by it's twisted and right-handed, twisted clockwise by this hydrogen bond. And we find that this twist is tightly curved and twisted to form to us the backbone of the protein. And when we look at the R groups or the side groups, we find that they are distributed outside the helix. Simply, this helix is formed by the hydrogen bonds which are linked the oxygen of the carboxylic group from one amino acid and the hydrogen of the amine group from the 4th amino acid. And because proteins are soluble in water, they will turn to create antibiotic regions within the protein, where the hydrophobic R groups or the hydrophobic regions of amino acids will be distributed in one side of the helix, and the hydrophilic will be distributed in one side, in the other side of the helix. As we see that here in the cell membrane, we find that proteins that are embedded inside the lipid wall or this lipid, they are hydrophobic, and the other chains are distributed inside the bubble and they are hydrophilic. Secondary structure or alpha helix is stabilized by hydrogen bonds, and we know that hydrogen bonds are weak, but collectively they are very strong to stabilize this structure. Beta sheet structure. Beta sheet structure is the most stable from secondary structure of protein, and they are formed by 2 separated polypeptide chains that are linked together by hydrogen bonds, as we see in this picture. These are polypeptide chain, and these are hydrogen bonds between the carboxyl group and the amine group of the amino acids that are from the beta-plated sheet. And the R groups are distributed because the beta sheet are planar or plated. They have planes, so the R groups are distributed upward or below the plane of the beta sheet structure. And beta-plated sheets are of two types: parallel, which are when two polypeptide sheets are run in the same direction, and we can determine this by looking at the ends of the polypeptide chains. If they are the same, like amino groups or N-terminus in the same, they are parallel chains, and they have these hydrogen bonds with them together. And the second one is the anti-parallel beta-plated sheets, which run in the opposite direction, and we determine them by looking at the ends. We see that they are opposite to each other. This is at C terminus, and this is N terminus. The third type is the B-terms or B-pens. B-pens are very important to form to us the tertiary structure. We have here 4 amino acids which are allow the secondary structure to change its direction during folding. And they are of many types, between beta and beta, or between beta and alpha helix and beta sheet, or between just alpha and alpha. This is all about the secondary structure. The tertiary structure is the final three-dimensional structure of the whole protein, and it's formed as a result of a large number of interactions between the amino acids that form the polypeptide chain. As we see in this picture, the tertiary structure is formed either by folding of beta-plated sheets or alpha-beta sheets, or both of them as a mix. The stability of the tertiary structure is based on a various and a large number of interactions between the amino acids in the whole protein, like the hydrogen bonds and disulfide bonds, and ionic interaction or electrostatic bonds, and hydrophobic interactions and hydrophilic interactions, and van der Waals forces. As we see here in this picture, when two amino acids like 2cysteine are close together after a result of folding of secondary structure, they will turn to form to us a disulfide bridge or disulfide bond. Or when two amino acids are hydrophobic, they will, when they are close to each other, they will revolve to each other and form a space like this. Or they will, when two amino acids, one of them have a hydroxyl, one of them has a carboxyl group, they will form a hydrogen bond. And finally, they will form to us a three-dimensional structure, which is the tertiary structure. The quaternary structure, when some of the proteins are composed of 2 or more subunits. The spatial arrangement of these subunits is known as a quaternary structure. For example, hemoglobin. We know that it's formed by beta-globin subunits, which are 2 and 2 alpha-globin subunits. Depending on the number of the polypeptide chain that form this protein, we can term the protein as a monomer if it has just one chain, or a dimer if it has 2 chains, or tetramer if it has 4 chains, and so on. And the forces that keep the quaternary structure are the hydrogen bonds, and electrostatic bonds, and hydrophobic bonds, and hydrophilic bonds, and van der Waals are forces. As we see in this picture, this is the hydrogen bonds, and this is the van der Waals forces, and the disulfide bond and salt bridges, which are ionic. Finally, conjugated proteins. On the basis of the composition of proteins are classified as simple proteins or conjugated proteins. Simple proteins have only amino acids, and conjugated proteins has a simple protein and non-protein part, which is called the procyclic group. And a protein without its procyclic group is called apoprotein, and when it's with its procyclic group, it's called a holoprotein. So what is the procyclic group? The procyclic group, for example, we have hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is a conjugated protein which has its procyclic group, which is the heme ring. The procyclic group is the cofactor that is required for the function of the protein. When we talk about enzymes, we know that enzymes are proteins, but they don't work. Except they bind with cofactor or coenzyme, which is another protein, and they work efficiently. But some proteins, they have another part of an inorganic part of protein group, which is heme, like hemoglobin, so to act perfectly. The coenzyme attached to the enzyme temporarily, but the protein group attached to the protein permanently. The heme group is a complex of protophrase 9 and ferrous iron, and the ferrous iron is present it binds to 4 nitrogen atoms of the porphyrin and is present in the center of the ring, and histidine forms 2 additional bonds with the histidine and the oxygen molecule in the hemoglobin, as we'll see in the next slide. And this is the heme ring, and with this porphyrin rings, which has double bond as a data system, which has resonance to form us the red color of the blood. And thank you.
The structure of hemoglobin and myoglobin. But before start, I will tell you that the study of the structure of the myoglobin will facilitate the study of the structure of the hemoglobin. So we will start with the myoglobin. We will study the myoglobin under the 4 points: definition, function, location, and structure, and the importance of the apoprotein part of the myoglobin. Now let's start with the definition. What is the definition of myoglobin? Myoglobin is a red globular protein that consists of single polypeptide chain consisting of 153 amino acids and with 17,000 molecular weight. It consists of, it is a conjugated protein because it consists of apoprotein part and prostatic group, which is the heme, as you see in this picture. We will explain that in details later. Function and position of the myoglobin. As you know, it has just 2 functions: storage of oxygen, and gives the red color to the muscles. Storage of oxygen: when the oxygen diffuses from the capillaries to the tissues, it is taken up by the myoglobin for the sake of tissue respiration. Then, number 2, it gives the red color for the muscle. So when we cut the muscle, the myoglobin leaks out from the muscle, as in this picture. This is not blood, not hemoglobin, but myoglobin. Location: myoglobin is found mainly in the skeletal muscles and the cardiac muscles, but recently it is believed that it is found in the smooth muscles of the blood vessels and has an important role in vasodilation. Now we will talk about the structure of the myoglobin. Myoglobin, as you know, the general structure composed of prostatic group and apoprotein part. This is the apoprotein part and the blue color, and we call it the globule, or this is the long polypeptide chain. It is the apoprotein part. And this is the prostatic group. It is the heme, the non-protein part. The heme, or the prostatic group, has been explained by my classmate Omar al-Hasani, but I want to tell you another thing, that all the carbon atoms of the chiral rings and the methane bridges are located in the same planar plane because they are sp2 hybridized. So they're located at the same planar plane. And another thing, that the ferrous iron here form 6 coordination bonds. We will focus on the 5th and the 6th coordination bonds. This is the 5th coordination bond between the ferrous iron and the 2 electrons of the nitrogen of the imidazole group of the proximal histidine. And the 6th coordination bond formed between the ferrous iron and the 2 electrons of the oxygen, the first oxygen atom of the oxygen molecule. Number two, the globin part. The globin part, as you know, it is a long polypeptide chain, consists of 153 amino acids. It has large alpha helical secondary structure that are folded into spherical tertiary structure, as you know. Approximately 75% of its polypeptide chain folded into 8 right-handed stretches called alpha helix. So this, they are named from A to H. They are A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H. Each one of them, this is alpha helix, this is alpha helix, this is alpha helix. For example, one of them, each alpha helix consists of 7 to 20 or 21 residues or amino acids. The proximal and distal histidine. This is the monopolypeptide chain, as you know, and consists of 153 amino acids. They are numbered from 1 until 153 amino acids. So we will focus on the amino acid number 58 and number 87. The amino acid number 58 is histidine, and this is the imidazole of this histidine imidazole group, and called the distal histidine. And we also call it the E7 histidine. Why we call it E7 histidine? Because it is E, because it is found in E alpha helix, and 7 because it is the seventh residue in E alpha helix. The same thing with the amino acid number 87. It is called the proximal histidine, and we call it also F8. Why we call it F8? F because it is located in F alpha helix, and 8 because it is the 8th residue in F alpha helix. This is another picture for clarity that the imidazole group of the distal histidine does not bind directly with the ferrous iron, but it forms a hydrogen bond here between the imidazole group and the ferrous and the oxygen that bind to the ferrous iron. Also, this is another picture. As you see here, this is the heme ring, and this is the globin part, and this is the proximal histidine that bind with the ferrous iron directly. This is the difference between the proximal histidine and the distal histidine. Why we call the distal histidine distal? This is the distal histidine because it doesn't bind directly with the ferrous iron. It doesn't bind, but it forms a hydrogen bond. This is the hydrogen bond that is formed between the distal histidine and the oxygen that bind to the ferrous iron. Then the hydrophobic pocket or the hydrophobic cleft. What is this pocket or what is this cleft? This is the hydrophobic cleft. It is the place that the heme are located in it. So how does this pocket form? I will tell you. We know the myoglobin is found in the cytoplasm of the muscle cell, and the cytoplasm of the muscle cell is composed mainly of water. This water creates two surfaces: to the apoprotein part, outer hydrophilic surface that loves the water. Here we see the outer hydrophilic surface, and inner we don't see the inner hydrophobic surface. But there is a pocket of the hydrophobic in the inner surface, so the inner hydrophobic surface that consists of the amino acids that have non-polar R groups, except small region. This is the small region. Why this small region is formed? Because of the distal histidine and the proximal histidine. They have the imidazole group, and the imidazole group is polar, so they form this pocket for binding with heme. So what is the hydrophobic cleft? This is the definition of the hydrophobic cleft. It is a crevice located between E alpha helix and F alpha helix, and at which the heme is located. This is another picture for clarity. This is the hydrophobic cleft, and this is the myoglobin. This is the proximal histidine, and this is the distal histidine. This is the heme ring, and in the center of the heme ring there is a ferrous iron. Binding of myoglobin with oxygen molecule. We know we have to know important thing that the oxygen comes to bind with the safe coordination site of the heme, of the ferrous iron, but there is a change between the oxygenated and deoxygenated heme. Look at this. This is heme without binding with oxygen. This is the plane of the heme ring, as you see here, and this is the ferrous iron. There is a small distance. It is 0.4 angstrom between the horizontal plane of the ferrous iron and the horizontal plane of the heme ring. But when the heme binding with oxygen, it was like this. It packers upward to become at the same or almost in the same plane, because this is the plane of the heme ring and this is the ferrous iron. The distance becoming only 0.1 angstrom. So this is confirmed. I want to show this informational change. I'm sorry for this. We cannot stand here. The protein, the other protein part, that is the globin, the polypeptide chain, provide hindered environment for the heme iron by the digital histidine. This environment increase and decrease the affinity of the heme for binding with oxygen and carbon monoxide, as we will see. How does this environment decrease and increase the affinity of the heme for different gases? You will see here. This is the oxygen when it comes to bind with the heme ring. It comes in oblique position, and this oblique position is not favorable for the heme to form a strong bond. So the affinity of the isolated heme without globin, isolated heme means heme without globin, the affinity of the isolated heme for binding with oxygen is very low. But because of the digital histidine, this is the digital histidine that form a hydrogen bond with the oxygen, it drag the level of the oxygen and turn it from the oblique position into the perpendicular position onto the plane of the heme, as you will see here. This is the oxygen molecule. Look at the change in the angle. It was 121 degree. Now it is 90 degree, and this position provide maximum overlapping between the two electrons of the oxygen and the ferrous iron. But in contrast, that happened to the carbon monoxide. This is the carbon monoxide when it comes to bind with the ferrous iron. Because the ferrous iron is sp hybridized, it comes in perpendicular position to the ferrous iron, and this provides maximum overlapping between the ferrous iron and the electrons of the carbon monoxide. So the affinity of the isolated heme, this is the isolated heme, to the carbon monoxide is 20,000 times than oxygen. But because of the digital histidine, this is the environment that the globin part provided. Because of the digital histidine that formed a hydrogen bond with the carbon monoxide, it dragged it to become an oblique position, and this decreased the affinity of the heme for binding with carbon monoxide from 20,000 times than oxygen to just 20 times only. And this is the end. Now, let's go to the hemoglobin. We will talk rapidly about the definition, position, function, and we will talk in small details about the structure. Hemoglobin is the red blood cell pigment, as you know. It is in males, the concentration of the hemoglobin in the blood in males more than in females. The position of the hemoglobin, as you know, it is located in the red blood cells, but not in the central part. It is located in the edges of the red blood cells. So when we see the red blood cells under the microscope, the central part of the red blood cell becomes pale because of the absence of the hemoglobin from the central part. Function of hemoglobin, as you know, transport of gases. It transport the oxygen from the lungs to all the tissues of the body, and transport the carbon dioxide from all tissues of the body to the lungs. And there is another function which is binding with or take the hydrogen ions from the tissues to the lungs in the buffer action. These functions will be explained by our students. Now let's go to the structure. As you know, the hemoglobin composed of 4 polypeptide chains and 4 hemes. So it is tetrameric protein, consists of 4 subunits. So, as we said before this, the myoglobin considered as 1 subunit of hemoglobin. So hemoglobin is composed of 4 polypeptide chains, 2 alpha chains and 2 beta chains. They are held together by non-covalent interaction. Each subunit has stretches of alpha helical structure in heme binding pocket similar to that described for the myoglobin. However, the tetrameric hemoglobin molecule is structurally and functionally have more complex. It is more complex than myoglobin because it binds with more than 1 gas. It binds with oxygen, hydrogen, carbon dioxide, but myoglobin binds just with 2 gases. The common form of the adult hemoglobin is made up of 2 chains, of 2 alpha chains and 2 beta chains. Each alpha chain, as you see here, composed of 141 amino acids, but each beta chain composed of 146 amino acids. Each chain of them contain 1 heme. So we have 4 hemes and 4 globins. This 4 hemes and 4 globins. This is globin, this is heme, and this is globin and heme. 4 hemes and globins. The 4 globin polypeptide chains with the 4 hemes held together in definite arrangement to form the quaternary structure of hemoglobin, which is stabilized by the hydrogen bonds and salt bridges and van der Waals forces, as you see here. This is the salt bridges between the 2 dimers. What is the dimers? I will explain it. But this, I want you to focus, this is the hydrogen bond, this is the salt bridges. We consider alpha and beta dimer 1. This is dimer and this is dimer. When we see the myoglobin, it's composed of 2 subunits, not of 4 subunits, as we will see here. Look at this. The myoglobin, the hemoglobin tetrameric can be visualized or can be seen as being composed of 2 identical dimers. Each dimer the number 1 alpha beta 1 and the dimer 2 called alpha beta 2, which numbered 1 and 2. This is alpha chain and this is beta chain. Number 1, focus on the number. This is alpha 1 chain and this is beta 1 chain. They are held together. They are held together by strong hydrophobic interaction. So when we see them, they form 1 subunit, and the alpha 2 chain and beta 2 chain form another dimer held also by strong hydrophobic interaction. So it can be visualized as composed of 2 dimers. They are held together by ionic and hydrogen bonds and sometimes salt bridges. This is another picture for more clarity. This is hemoglobin, and this is polypeptide chain. This is dimer, considered as dimer. This is alpha beta dimer 1, and this is alpha beta dimer 2. They held together. The bonds between the 2 dimers are ionic and hydrogen bonds, as you see, and they are weak and sometimes salt bridges. They break down when interchanged from the deoxygenated into the oxygenated state. Look, Here they are 5, I think, and there is 3. Because you will learn later that the hemoglobin change from the T state to the R state, from the tense to the relaxed state. So some ionic and hydrogen bonds, they are breakdown. And because of the allostric changes that happened when the oxygen comes to bind with the heat. This is the allostric changes. It will be explained with Usama Bahta.
Characterize the structure of hemoglobin. So we can say the hemoglobin is an allostric protein, which means has two receptor sites, one for the ligand and the other for allosteric effectors. When the allosteric effectors bind to protein, it will cause a conformational change in its structures and affecting the ligand affinity in positive or negative way, depending on the type of the effector molecules. So when this effector affected in positive way, it's called positive allosteric effectors. These positive allosteric effectors bind to proteins and will cause a conformational change in its structures, making the active sites available for the ligand with the blue color. And as we know that in hemoglobin, the oxygen is a ligand. And when the positive allosteric effectors bind to hemoglobin, it induces a conformational change in hemoglobin structures, increasing its ability to bind more oxygen. But why? Why the positive allosteric effectors increases the affinity for oxygen? Because it stabilizes the R state of hemoglobin. As we know that the R state have the highest affinity for the oxygen. In another side, we have the negative allosteric effectors. The negative allosteric effectors bind to protein and will cause a conformational change in its structures, making the active sites is unavailable for the ligand. So, the allosteric effectors, when you bind to hemoglobin, it is known as inhibitor bind to hemoglobin, which means decreasing the affinity for oxygen and stabilizing the T state of hemoglobin. Why the negative allosteric effectors by decreasing the affinity for oxygen? Because it's stabilizing the T state of hemoglobin. The hemoglobin have two types of allosteric effectors. The first one is homotropic and the other heterotropic. In case of homotropic, the oxygen is allosteric effectors and the ligand. When he binds, where the binding of oxygen at one side will increases the affinity for binding the oxygen at another side of hemoglobin. So the oxygen here is positive allosteric effectors. In another one, the heterotropic, in this case, another substances other than ligand act as allosteric effectors like proton and carbon dioxide and 2.3 biphosphoglycerate. In the first one, the protons decreases the affinity for oxygen in the hemoglobin. How the proton do that? The proton realized from the activity metabolizing tissues will bind to oxyhemoglobin and in RBCs, and this promoting the release of oxygen from the tissue from the hemoglobin to the tissues, and this will stabilizing the T state. But the question here, how the proton stabilize the T state of hemoglobin? He will protonate in the imidazole group of histidine and form a positive charge. This positive charge will participate in salt bridge with negatively charged aspartate. The formation of this bond will hold the structure of protein together and form the T state of hemoglobin and decreasing the affinity for oxygen. The another one is carbon dioxide. It reacts with amino terminus of hemoglobin, and for the carboamino hemoglobin, it is the allosteric site. This will promote the release of oxygen to the tissues and stabilizing the T state. The last one is biphosphoglycerate. It is the negatively charged molecules bind to pocket in the center of deoxyhemoglobin. This pocket contains a lot of positively charged amino acids like histidine and glycine. This positive charge will bind with negative charge of 2.3 biphosphoglycerate and form the cell bridge and stabilize the T state of hemoglobin. That's everything. I will begin now. Why?
As Mr. Osama talked about, the allosteric factors and they affect on the hemoglobin positively or negatively. I will talk about here hydrogen ions and carbon dioxide. They affect on the hemoglobin in such way that the release of oxygen is increased to supply the body tissues. The hydrogen ions and the carbon dioxide. The hydrogen ions and the carbon dioxide has the ability to bind to hemoglobin. When they bind to hemoglobin, they make it somehow charged on some specific places. These some specific places becomes a charge to bind with another amino acid residues found on the chain of the chains of hemoglobin, and they form some salt bridges. They form some salt bridges that help in the stabilizing of the T structure of hemoglobin. And when stabilizing of the T structure of hemoglobin, that means there is no oxygen can bind to the hemoglobin, and it helps in the release or increase the release of amounts of oxygen to supply the body tissues. Allosteric factors such as hydrogen ions and carbon dioxide effects on the oxygen dissociation curve, as I will explain it here. I will go back to these some slides, but I will explain here the effect of hydrogen ions and carbon dioxide on the oxygen dissociation curve. On the oxygen dissociation curve, we have here on the Y is saturation in presence with oxygen, and here we have the partial pressure of oxygen in millimeter mercury. When the number of or the value of pH in blood is about 7.2, and this is the normal 7.2 or 7.4. This is the pH of blood. In this, the shape of the oxygen dissociation curve looks sigmoidal in this shape, in like sigmoidal. Looks sigmoidal as it sounds here, but look here, when we lower the pH to 7.2, this is 7.6 or 7.4 is the normal pH of the blood. But here is 7.2. When we lower the pH, that means we increase the hydrogen ions. Lowering pH and increasing the acidity. This which occur in the high metabolic or active metabolic cells of the body. We got that the oxygen dissociation curve shifts to the right. So this is the Bohr effect. The Bohr effect said that the hydrogen ions and the carbon dioxide shifts the oxygen dissociation curve somehow to the right because they lower the pH of blood. From where does the hydrogen ions or the carbon dioxide are produced? We will go back here to say this reaction that occurs to produce the hydrogen ions and the carbon dioxide. They are here found from the cells or high metabolic cells. Here carbon dioxide reacts with water. Carbon dioxide produced from the high metabolically cells produce and react with water with the help of the enzyme, specific enzyme called carbonic anhydrase to form the carbonic acid. The carbonic acid is a good acid that dissociates to get hydrogen ions and to get bicarbonate. The hydrogen ions bind with hemoglobin to form the deoxyhemoglobin. The deoxyhemoglobin is transported to the lungs, whereas dissociated to get the hydrogen ions and the hemoglobin here, because the amount of oxygen in the blood, the amount of oxygen in the lungs are in high concentration. When there is a high concentration of hydrogen, as Mr. Muhammad explained, there are two dimers of alpha beta dimers in the hemoglobin. They rotate with respect to each other in about 15 degrees and helps in squeezing of another molecule that I will explain later, which is 2 and 3 bisphosphoglycerate. I will explain it later. And when this molecule is taken out from the inside cavity of the hemoglobin, it gives the ability of oxygen to bind with hemoglobin. I'll go now to talk about the molecule which is 2 and 3 bisphosphoglycerate. As we see, it is a saccharide, or it is a 3-carbon sugar occurring naturally in the RBCs. It occurs naturally in the RBCs, and the amount is similar as we found the hemoglobin in the red blood cells. So it is the most, why we choose here the bisphosphoglycerate, 2 and 3 bisphosphoglycerate, not any other phosphate, because it's found in the blood in the RBCs in a higher amount, as I said, as the same as the hemoglobin of the blood. It binds here in the middle, and there is a central cavity between the two beta globins. It binds, and we see it has 5 negative charges found in the phosphate group, and there on the other two. They bound with 6 negative, and there are 6 negative groups or 6 negative charges found on amino acid residues in the beta hemoglobin. When it binds with this, when it binds here, it forms salt bridges, and these salt bridges stabilizes the T state of the hemoglobin. Stabilizes the T state of the hemoglobin, increases the release amount of the oxygen. Here is what I explained about it, and now I will talk about when we talked in physiology that RBCs increase in hypoxia. How this occurs in biochemistry. Here is a curve showing the effect of this molecule 2 and 3 BBG or bisphosphoglycerate on the oxygen dissociation curve, as Khalid will explain it later. Here is the normal oxygen dissociation curve, as we said before. And the amount of 3 and 2 bisphosphoglycerate is 5 millimole per liter in the blood. This is the normal. But when it is increased, and when there is 2 and 3 BBG, that means the oxygen release is high, and the oxygen cannot bind more. So when people live in high altitude areas such as mountains, their RBCs is increased. Their RBCs is increased, as we said in physiology, to adapt with the places or to adapt with the change in the high altitude. In the high altitude, the 3 BBG is found in higher amounts than it's found as we are living here, not adapted with high altitudes or high places such as mountains. The amount of 2 and 3 BBG, for example, increased into about 8 millimole per liter. And this also affect on the oxygen dissociation curve, which shifted to the right. And the number of RBCs must increase, to allow more oxygen to bind, because there is a lot of 2 and 3 BBG molecules in their blood as they are in high altitudes. Finally, I will talk about the binding of these molecules to HbF, or the hemoglobin of fetus inside the uterus. As we studied in embryology, we know that the hemoglobin of embryo has higher affinity to bind with oxygen than the hemoglobin of adults. How this is affected structurally? As we know, the hemoglobin is formed of 2 dimers, alpha and beta dimers, two alpha chains and two beta chains. But in the embryology or the hemoglobin of the fetus does not contain the two beta chains. It contains two alpha and two gamma chains. The gamma chains has less amino acid, not has less amino acid residues, but it has different amino acid residues. That those sex positive charges found in the HBA are not sex here. They are 4 because some amino acid residues are changed, such as histidine 143 is a polar amino acid, and here in the HBF it's replaced with non-polar amino acid, which is serine. So there is no suitable place for BBG or the previous molecule. There is no suitable places for 3-BBG, which has 5 negative charges to bind with the hemoglobin. So it's unfavorable environment for BBG for 2 and 3-PBG to bind with oxygen with the hemoglobin. And when there is less amounts of 3-BBG or carbon dioxide or H ions, there are a lot of amounts of oxygen that are bounded to. Thank you. There are a lot of amounts of oxygen that are bounded to hemoglobin. This is not all I will talk about, all I have to talk about. And now I will leave you with Mr. Khaled explaining the oxygen dissociation curve.
After I explain the dissociation curve for hemoglobin and hemoglobin, we explain the more aspect on this curve. I think we should understand what is the dissociation curve for hemoglobin and hemoglobin. So we know in our bodies we have two different proteins, hemoglobin and hemoglobin. And these two proteins carry out the function of carrying oxygen and bringing oxygen from lungs to tissues. And in the lecture of hemoglobin and myoglobin, when we studied that lecture in Harvard's biochemistry, our professor and before a few minutes, our friends explained the structure of myoglobin and hemoglobin. And they said that myoglobin and hemoglobin contains heme groups. And we know that myoglobin has a single polypeptide chain, so it has a single heme group. But in hemoglobin, because we have 4 different polypeptide chains, we have 4 different heme groups. And the most important thing we should know that one heme group can bind to only one oxygen molecule. And here I have a question. Why does our body need 2 different proteins to carry out the same function, which is carrying oxygen from lungs to tissues? The answer is because these 2 proteins are or have slightly different structures, slightly different properties, and therefore slightly different functions. And we will see this in the next slides. Okay, in biochemistry, we use something called oxygen dissociation curve for myoglobin and hemoglobin. And also it's known as oxygen binding curve for hemoglobin and myoglobin, according to the direction of explaining this curve. So let's start with explaining these 2 curves for myoglobin and hemoglobin. The green curve for myoglobin and the red one is for hemoglobin. And I'll start explaining the dissociation curve for myoglobin. For myoglobin, a simple curve is observed here, this myoglobin curve. It shows that as the concentration, before I start the myoglobin curve, we should know this graph on the board contains the y-axis and the x-axis. This y-axis and this x-axis. The y-axis describes the concentration of proteins, hemoglobin, myoglobin with oxygen, and is expressed in percentage. It ranges from 0% to 100%. 0% means that all sites are empty. There is not any proteins attached with or bound with oxygen. But 100% means all sites are full. 100% of the myoglobin or hemoglobin molecules are bound to oxygen. And y-axis here describes what? Describes the concentration of the oxygen molecule. And because oxygen is a gas, we describe the concentration of oxygen molecules as partial pressure of oxygen. And it's expressed in millimeters of mercury. And it ranges from 0 to 100 millimeters of mercury. So for myoglobin, simple curve is observed. It shows that as the concentration of oxygen increases, here, you should notice here in the x-axis, as the concentration of the oxygen increases, there is a sharp increase in the curve of myoglobin, the curve of binding. I can say this curve is the dissociation curve, if I will explain from this direction backwards. And binding curve if I will explain it from this direction to this direction. Okay, in fact, at a pH of 2 millimeters of mercury, if the concentration or partial pressure of oxygen is 2 millimeters of mercury, 50% of the protein molecules, myoglobin molecules, will be saturated with oxygen. And what does this mean? This means that myoglobin binds to oxygen strongly and has a very strong or a very high affinity for attach and bind with oxygen. Myoglobin doesn't release oxygen until the partial pressure of oxygen is too low. As we notice here, if I will explain, here if I will decrease the concentration of the oxygen, the curve of dissociation for myoglobin remains bind to oxygen and doesn't release the oxygen until the partial pressure is too low. If there is too low quantity of oxygen, the myoglobin starts to release the oxygen. So myoglobin is used to store oxygen and not a good carrier for oxygen, as I will explain this in the next slides. Like myoglobin, hemoglobin shows a sigmoidal curve, S-shaped curve. And what does this mean? What does sigmoidal curve mean? It means that hemoglobin has a lower affinity for oxygen than myoglobin. And myoglobin binds oxygen with less affinity than myoglobin, and in fact, a concentration of 26 millimeter of mercury is needed to make the 50% of the hemoglobin to be saturated with oxygen. We said in myoglobin, what is the partial pressure of oxygen which is needed to make the 50% of the myoglobin molecules to be bound with oxygen? It was 2 millimeters of mercury. And this means what? This means the myoglobin has a very high affinity for oxygen. But in hemoglobin, the partial pressure which is needed to make the 50% of the hemoglobin molecules to be bound and saturated with oxygen is 26 millimeters of mercury. So its affinity for oxygen is lesser than myoglobin. And this explains why our body prefers the hemoglobin as oxygen carrier and not myoglobin. So from this curve describes the properties of myoglobin and hemoglobin. So hemoglobin binds oxygen less strongly than myoglobin and has a lower affinity for myoglobin and releases oxygen much more easily than myoglobin. Why does hemoglobin can release the oxygen more easily than myoglobin? Because in the previous slides, Usama explained the allostatic effects for myoglobin and hemoglobin curve. The myoglobin is bound to the oxygen in non-cooperative fashion, but hemoglobin is bound to oxygen in a cooperative fashion. So the hemoglobin is bound to the oxygen in a cooperative fashion, and this means if I have hemoglobin, there is 4 sides of hemoglobin, 4 heme groups. If one heme group is bound to one oxygen molecule, this makes the other unoccupied sites more likely to bind oxygen. This makes the other sites has more affinity for oxygen. And conversely, the release of oxygen from one side on the hemoglobin makes the other occupied sites more likely to release the oxygen. And this makes the hemoglobin a good carrier for oxygen. Physiologically, this means that hemoglobin is a perfect oxygen carrier because it can easily bind oxygen in lungs and release this oxygen in tissues because of the cooperative fashion. Conclusion, myoglobin doesn't bind oxygen cooperatively, which makes it great at storing oxygen in the muscle cell. And it releases this oxygen for the muscle cell when there is a low quantity of oxygen. It will not release the oxygen until the partial pressure of oxygen is too low, as I explained that in the curve before in the previous slide. On the other hand, hemoglobin cooperative behavior and this makes it a great oxygen carrier. It can easily pick up the oxygen in the lungs and drop it off on the tissue cells. Now, I want to comparison between the dissociation curve for myoglobin and hemoglobin and why our body prefers the hemoglobin as a good oxygen carrier. There are 3 facts we should know them before explaining these dissociation curves. In our lungs, the partial pressure of oxygen is about 1 millimeters of mercury. And in resting tissue, the partial pressure of oxygen is about 40 millimeters of mercury. And in exercising tissue, if we are running or swimming, for example, the partial pressure for oxygen is 20 millimeters of mercury. So here the dissociation curve. Here the dissociation curve for hemoglobin. At this point, 100 millimeters of mercury partial pressure of oxygen in the lungs. And as hemoglobin travels from the lung to the resting tissue and after that to that exercising tissue, we show here difference between what? The Y value at this point at 100. If the partial pressure of oxygen is 100%, what is the value of the saturation? It will be 98% saturated with oxygen. So if the hemoglobin molecule travels from the lungs to the resting tissue, we know in the resting tissue what is the partial pressure of oxygen. It's about 40 millimeters of mercury. So there's a difference here from lungs to resting tissues, 98% minus 77%, and it equals 22% oxygen unloaded. And this means 21% of the hemoglobin molecules will release the oxygen for the resting tissues. And on the exercising tissues, 98% minus 32%, and this means 66% of oxygen will be loaded from the hemoglobin molecules. But in myoglobin, here in this dissociation curve, if we will go to the lungs, in the lungs the partial pressure of oxygen is equals 100 millimeters of mercury, and the Y value equals 98%. It's the same as hemoglobin. In the lungs, the myoglobin and hemoglobin saturated with oxygen. But when the myoglobin travels from the lungs to the resting tissues, as we notice here, because sharp curve, it is not decreased in this curve. So in 40 millimeter mercury, the saturation will be 91%. So the difference will be 1% oxygen unloaded. And this means 1% of the myoglobin molecules will release the oxygen for resting tissues. And this is very low quantity of oxygen. And it's not enough for the resting tissues. And in exercising tissues, it will 7% of the myoglobin molecules will release the oxygen, and this also is not enough. So our body prefers the hemoglobin as oxygen carrier than myoglobin. And now, after explaining the curve, we will say animation explaining the oxygen transport. For teaching us and created a great interest in us to study and read the biochemistry topics and related and link them to the physiology and medicine. And thank you for your good listening.